All right, welcome to another John Banks Civil War blog podcast. We have a very interesting guest, Laura DeMarco, who has written a book, and I'm going to hold it up here for all our viewers. Lost Civil War, the disappearing legacy of America's greatest conflict. And Laura, I'll try to zoom in on that a little bit, and we'll make sure we get your name. There it is. There's your name over there, Laura. Yep. That's great. And this is really a beautiful book. In addition to wonderful photography, there's excellent text by Laura. And some of these sites, the book is about sites that have either disappeared or largely gone from the Civil War landscape. But before, Laura, we get into the book, why don't you tell us a little bit about you and who you are and what you do and what your life's like?
Oh, that's a tall order. So thank you, first of all, for having me on your podcast blog here, John. I really appreciate it. Lost Civil War is actually my fourth book. I'm a Cleveland-based writer. I worked for 20 years in the field of journalism. My background, my degree is in English literature and art history. And for 20 years, I worked at the daily paper in Cleveland, covering a wide variety of topics, and everything from not sports, every other topic besides sports, feature stories, news stories, a lot of arts and culture. And about 5 years or so ago, I got more interested in writing about history. And at the time, it was local history. I'm a third generation Clevelander, and I'd grown up hearing all these stories about Cleveland. And I just started digging into them more. And I began writing a series called Lost Cleveland for the paper. Eventually, this kind of outgrew the paper. And on a whim, I wrote to a publisher called Pavilion Books, who are based in London, England.
Mm-hmm.
And they publish architectural heritage books. And I said, you have all these books about cities like Detroit and New York, Chicago, Berlin, Paris. These are all great cities, but Cleveland in its day was a great city too. Would you be interested in publishing a book about Cleveland? And to my great surprise, they were. They got back really quickly and said yes. And that led to my 2016 book, Lost Cleveland, which was much like the Lost Civil War. It's the same publisher. It was about places that are gone in the city of Cleveland and kind of telling a city's story through what wasn't there anymore. That led a year later to another book because I got so tired of talking about everything that was gone. And this was Cleveland Then and Now, which talked about things that were still in Cleveland, telling that history through transformation.
Interesting. Laura,
yeah,
I have some breaking news for you though.
What's that?
I'm from Pittsburgh.
Okay.
So,
well, we can get along as long as we don't talk about sports.
I grew up a Steelers fan, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that I don't have high hopes for the Steelers this year, as I'm sure you have high hopes for the Browns. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No. For about the first time in a very long time, I have high hopes for the Browns.
Yes, yes. Congratulations.
Thank you. We'll see how that goes.
Sort of. Congratulations.
Yeah. And in fact, Cleveland Stadium is in Lost Cleveland book, because that was a great old stadium there.
Yes.
A lot of great games. The Steelers played there too, of course. So that led to Cleveland Then and Now. And then, I mentioned earlier my degree is in English literature. And this, again, for Pavilion Books, about 2 years ago, they came to me and I was talking with the publisher about Mark Twain. I love Mark Twain, and so does he. He's a British publisher. And that led to this book where we applied the then and now concept to Mark Twain, because he's really one of the greatest American writers, and he was so many things. He was born in the South, in the slave holding days, although his family never held slaves. He moved to the West. He died a Yankee. So it was sort of telling Mark Twain's story through the geography of his life. And of course that included his time in the Civil War, or really his lack of time in the Civil War, because Mark Twain, he's from Missouri, basically fled. During the Civil War, he went to the West, and that's when he did his Roughing It. So you touched on that. And then, to make a long story a little bit shorter, that book eventually led to Lost Civil War, because I was getting more into Civil War history. I'm talking with a publisher about it. And this tied in with my personal history. my father and mother both were big history buffs. You know, we took so many vacations, as maybe you did too, John, where, you know,
Yeah.
we just piled in the family station wagon, you know, went to Gettysburg or, you know, also up to Boston to see Revolutionary War history, Philadelphia, down to Charleston, Savannah. So, you know, we took all these trips as a kid, and of course, Washington, D.C., a lot of time spent around there in Virginia. And, you know, at the time, I don't know how, you know, as a teenager, maybe I didn't appreciate getting up at 6 a.m. for these rigidly structured vacations. But in retrospect, I am so grateful to my parents for exposing us to that history. So they are both deceased. This book is actually dedicated to them for inspiring my love of history and Civil War history in particular. So, you know, that combined with sort of the relationship I had with Pavilion and writing about history led to Lost Civil War, which just came out in June.
That's awesome. And yeah, I remember my long ago trips to Gettysburg when I was 12 years old and packing in the family car and dad buying us some mini balls at the place on Baltimore Street, which still is there. So I was going through the book today, Laura, and for our viewers and listeners, many of the sites may be familiar. There's Cold Harbor and Wilderness,
Right.
and Dunkirk Church at Antietam, but there are also some places which, you know, and I've been to many of the places in your book, but some of them I was unfamiliar with. And one place in particular intrigued me was a site in Louisiana. Could you tell us a little bit about that? Because there's a cult involved, right?
Oh, the fort. Yeah, that's to me one of the most fascinating stories in the book. You know, as you mentioned, a lot of these places are going to be places that people, especially history buffs and historians, have heard of before. But there's a lot of new things to uncover here, and I really tried to be sensitive to that as I was writing. This is Fort St. Philip. It actually dates back to before the Louisiana Purchase. So, you know, it's a historical fort that was used in the War of 1812, and then again in the Civil War. And it's on an island in the river. You got some pictures there?
Oh yeah.
And so, you know, when New Orleans fell, the fort eventually was, you know, not in short order, did too, but obviously the equipment stayed there and so on. After the war, because of its remoteness, it kind of became overgrown, but that didn't stop people from trying to use this land for some nefarious purposes. For a while, many decades after the war, it became a tannery, which is not too terrible, but later, then during the Civil Rights Movement, this is kind of especially awful when you think of it in the context of the Civil War. It was intended to be used as a place to arrest and detain, you know, civil rights activists and protesters. They even put up barbed wire and so on. That didn't actually eventually happen. And then even stranger, it became home to something called the Vella Ashby Intentional Community, which is, yes, probably a cult.
Yes.
Yes, intentional community.
Look that up, but I trust you.
Yeah. No, if you can look it up, you'll see a lot more about it.
Yeah.
So they, you know, a couple dozen people live there. They liked it because very isolated, and their leader actually ended up killing himself, and they sort of disbanded on the former fort, as you see the pictures of the ruins there.
Yes.
And then Hurricanes Katrina and Rita sort of put an end to it. But I thought it was one of the most fascinating stories that almost got more fascinating like after the Civil War.
Yes, it is. And you can only get there by helicopter and boat,
Yes.
Is that right?
That is true, yeah.
Have you been there before?
I have not been there, no. So those pictures were from someone who had been there on a helicopter. They try to limit them, you know, it's not really even allowed to go there anymore. So,
Well,
I'm not recommending this to anybody listening or watching here.
Oh no, your book has inspired me. I'm about to make a trip, so at some point this summer. So
here are your pictures if you go.
Yeah, I'll send you some photos and post them to Facebook. Yeah. So what was the process that you went through? I mean, first of all, as I mentioned at the beginning of our chat here, is that the book is really a beautiful book. There's many beautiful period photos in there. There are some present day pictures too. How did you go about selecting what you wanted to write about? Because you not only write about battlefields, you also write about historic buildings, the Dunkirk Church being one, the Marshall House in Alexandria and some other places. Tell us about how you went through the process of writing and choosing the photographs for the book?
Okay. Well, the key word in the title is really lost. So this is not, there's so much Civil War history that you can still see. There's a lot of it. The intent with this book was to talk about things that are being lost, as the subtitle says, the disappearing, legacy. Whether that's a battlefield being paved over, a building that was demolished, a fort that has, been lost to time. I mean, most of these things honestly have been lost through nothing nefarious, but through suburban development, especially around the Virginia and Washington, D.C. area. So, I mean, there's so many thousands of great books about the Civil War. So to narrow the focus, this was to be about things that were lost, buildings, battlefields, hospitals, forts, cycloramas, just anything, ships too, that you couldn't really see anymore. Or some of them, like Ford's Theater, have been rebuilt, but they're not the exact original structure, even if they look like it. And it originally was going to be more about just battlefields, but you could do a whole book. There's so many battlefields that are lost, but honestly, like looking at all the photos of battlefield after battlefield after battlefield, field after field, isn't quite as visually interesting. So once we had the lost concept in mind, the next step was to look at photos. And of course I had a list of places, but it was much longer than what made it into the book. And then I was just really going through thousands of photos at the Library of Congress and local historical societies, national park sites, and so on. And there's some places you had to include, obviously. There's some places I would have liked to include in, maybe that the photos didn't work out. So it was kind of a balancing act of must include places and places that just really had remarkable, photos as well.
Yes, and one of the intriguing places, of course, any Civil War Zoomcast worth its salt, you need to mention Gettysburg.
Right.
And you talk about a site that perhaps the casual visitor to Gettysburg doesn't really know anything about.
Yeah.
And that's Camp Letterman. Why don't you tell us something about that?
Yeah, so of course, there's no more important, probably, or better known battle in American history than Gettysburg. But not every story about Gettysburg is known. And one of the really important ones is about Camp Letterman, which was really responsible sort of for developing the concept of battlefield medicine in the United States and really worldwide. The casualties at Gettysburg were so enormous and so fast, there wasn't time to move people on trains to hospitals and so on. So they set up on a nearby farm a enormous tent-based hospital. It had triage units, it had surgical wards that were intense. I mean, the number of amputations that took place there is unfortunately very huge. And so people were able to be triaged there and treated. Those who were not quite as badly injured then could be moved on. It was named after a doctor who sort of developed this battlefield medicine concept. And also what's interesting about that is one of the first hospitals in the war that not only was it a battlefield hospital, they had large numbers of nurses there and female nurses. So it was interesting in that respect. So it's really important in medical history as well as Civil War history. A couple months after, obviously everybody who could be was moved on either to home or back to fighting or to more permanent hospital. And sadly today there is very, very little to remind visitors, and there are thousands, hundreds of thousands to Gettysburg about this. There was a little marker near a Sheetz gas station there on the site of it. And I just did another talk last week, and I spoke with someone who had just been there like that. So I did a talk on the anniversary of Gettysburg, and someone had been there within the week, and they said it's even surrounded by like weeds and just overgrown now. It's really sad. So because it was so important.
Yeah, I've seen it, and then of course you also, my favorite battlefield is Antietam, and I know anybody who has been to Antietam has seen the little whitewashed church, the Dunker Church, that was a focal point of the battle, but that has an interesting history in itself too. So why did you include that, the Dunker Church, in your book, Laura?
I think just because of such, the Dunkers were such a, Dunker, if you don't know, refers to the way that they baptize people in that sect. They were very religious, pacifistic even, and the fact that such a huge battle raged around them in this church and that it stood, for a while, I think is fascinating, that a place that should have been a sanctuary became something, so different. And it was said when in the smoke of battle that sometimes that white church is what stood out to people. They could actually still see it there.
So what's its history though? There's a backstory to it. It was blown down in a storm in the 1920s. Is that right?
Yeah, there was like a major storm. I'd have to actually look up the year. I don't remember that off the top of my head. But yeah, so it didn't fare well, these Dunkers, despite their great religious fervor. Their church had quite a tough history. Let me look it up here, tell you what year that was.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Laura.
Well, that's okay. I have a lot of dates in my head, but that is not one
I hear
know
you.
off the top
It sounds
of my
like
head.
it, yes.
So Dunker Church, it came through the war with damage, and services resumed by 1864, but it was flattened by windstorm. It was 1921. So it wasn't there for a few more decades after that. And then it just became too expensive for them to rebuild and maintain so far out, from sort of the center of population there. But there is a recreation of it that was, constructed. It's not the original one, but it does look like it.
Yes. So Laura, do you have of all the places in the book, do you have some favorites that you, some of the places where you go, dang, I wish that place were absolutely still here so we could really soak up, breathe in the history of that place.
Well, you actually mentioned to my favorite. I think we're thinking alike, Camp Letterman and Fort St. Philip. I also find very interesting Chambersburg, the only northern city to really be burned during the war in retaliation for sort of the total warfare that the North was waging in the South. And I find that very interesting. And I mean, historians know that, but I don't know that a lot of, how well, just your casual student knows that. So I find that sort of an interesting place to talk about and hear about. One of my favorite photos in the war is of the twin houses in Fair Oaks.
Oh yeah.
I think a lot of people have seen those houses. And what's interesting about that, so these were two houses, in the Seven Pines, Fair Oaks battlefield area. And it looked like two houses in the middle there that people would see. But actually what it was wings of one house, and the house wasn't completed. So the part in the middle wasn't completed. So I find that to be some of the most striking imagery, to see these soldiers around there, and it looks like these two houses, twin houses. They look exactly alike in the middle of nowhere because they're really just sort of wings of one house that was meant to be.
So Laura, what happened to the twin houses?
They were demolished after the war.
Got you. Like a lot of.
Yeah. Well, yes, and they were battle scarred. Another one of my favorite stories in the book is of the Washington Arsenal. I don't know if you saw that part. So, there was the civil defenses of Washington, D.C. The city was so well fortified, and there was never a huge loss of life in the city in the capital, Washington, D.C. But there was actually a really interesting story about the Washington Arsenal, because it actually had one of the single largest day loss of life, and that was not of soldiers, but it was of women, mostly very young Irish immigrant women who were working in the arsenal there. And I think that's another lesser known story about the Civil War by the general population, is we know the vast and horrifying number of young men who died in the war, but women also played their role in it. A lot of them, especially the poor ones, the younger ones, worked in these arsenals and armories making weapons. And I had to look up the date again. June 17th, 1864, 21 young women were killed there in an accidental explosion. And a lot of them was because their hoop skirts caught on fire, because they were doing this dirty work, but they were still wearing their, big hoop skirts. And the tragedy was so great that President Lincoln went to the funeral, and there is a memorial for them in Washington at the cemetery.
That's an amazing story. And where I'm from in Pittsburgh was the Allegheny Arsenal, where many women were killed in that explosion on September 17th, 1862, the same date as the Battle of Antietam. Laura, there's one image in your book that almost makes me get weepy. Is this beautiful photo of the Shenandoah Valley?
Oh.
And and you mentioned, I'm glad you mentioned that in your book that I-81 slices through 7 battlefields from Port Republic to Winchester. And when I saw that photo in your book, I got a little teary-eyed, because every time I go up I-81, and I'm not ashamed to say this, Laura, I kind of flip the bird at I-81, because it's done such tremendous damage to Cedar Creek and other battlefields. So thank you for including that in your book.
It's really remarkable. And that's the first lost location in the book, because 7 battlefields cuts through.
Yes.
It's just the history that you drive over when you drive on that concrete there is pretty intense.
I hate I-81, Laura. I hate it with a passion.
I don't regularly drive on it since
I did a couple of weeks ago, and it was not a great experience. Laura, we just have a couple minutes left.
Sure.
I wanted to ask you about, you include a section at the back of the book on Confederate monuments. What was the thinking in including that? I'm curious.
Well, I don't think you can write a book about lost Civil War, especially in 2020, 2021, and not talk about monuments, because even when people hear the title of this book, they think the whole book is about that, and it's not. But I felt like I had to touch on it because, I'm talking about the history that's being paved over and so on, but there's this other aspect of history, but it's not necessarily Civil War history, as you know. A lot of those, actually the majority of those statues were put up long after in Jim Crow for, racist reasons. And I felt I just couldn't talk about things being lost without talking about that, because it's been a very powerful movement, especially since the murder of George Floyd, to get rid of those statues. But it dates back to the civil rights era again. And, the National Trust and a lot of other groups have said, that they do support the removal of these, because I could find a thing to read about it, because they're not really Civil War monuments, and they cause such hurt and pain. And I think another really powerful image is this, the Robert E. Lee surrounded by graffiti there. Not all history, we don't have to see it all every day. And this is just a synopsis of what the National Trust for Historic Preservation, they provided some guidance, and they said, while some have suggested the removal may result in erasing history, we believe that removal may be necessary to achieve the greater good of ensuring racial justice and equality. And you can read their full statement online. But I did feel that it was important to talk about those, to make clear that most of them weren't, from the Civil War, and the Civil War history loss that we should be mourning is the Shenandoah Valley, being paved over and so on, and not these, sort of inherently racist monuments.
Yes. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question, Laura. Sure. But first, I'm going to hold the book up one more time.
Thank you.
There you go. And I want to get Laura's name in there too. Laura DeMarco, Lost Civil War: The Disappearing Legacy of America's Greatest Conflict. This is in Barnes & Noble. I saw it here in Nashville, which was gratifying. And that means your publisher is getting the book out there. That's awesome.
I'm glad.
Wanted to ask you one more question. I do that with all the guests, Laura. If you could go back into time and talk to one person from the Civil War, who would that be and why?
I gave this some thought, because you suggested you would be talking about this. And of course, I'd love to ask, Ulysses S. Grant, did you ever have doubts and so on? But I think Matthew Brady, because photography is so important in the history of the Civil War. This whole book has, more than 200 photos, but it's so important because before the Civil War, people learned about war through these glorious paintings. They were really romanticized what war was. And, Napoleon in battle and so on. And the Civil War, much like Vietnam with TV, which came into our living rooms. The Civil War really, photography really brought home the impact of war. I mean, most people, they knew they had a son, a father, a husband, a brother fighting. But for everybody to see like the Dead at Antietam, that photo show in New York, to see the terrible, terrible toll on young men and the land and horses and so on. It was so important. And it is to this day. I mean, it was a great moment in photography history, war history, and journalism history. And I think I would just ask them, like, did he or these other photographers, did they know what an impact they would have? Did they know they were changing the whole narrative and the way people would view war really forever?
I think that's a good choice, Laura. He and Alexander Gardner would might be one of my choices.
Yeah.
Well, listen, for a Pittsburgher and a Clevelander, I'm happy that there were no arguments during our chat here. Laura, I want to thank you. I want to say sort of good luck to the Browns this year. You've been very generous with your time. And again, this is a terrific book. It's available in Barnes and Noble, and I'm sure elsewhere.
Can I just say, if people are interested in more information about the book or me or anything, they can go to laurademarcoauthor.com.
Excellent. Anything else? Do you have a website? Besides the website? I'm sorry.
I have a Instagram. It's at Lost Cleveland. I'm on Twitter.
Okay.
If you're in the Cleveland area, I include updates on events and talks that I'm doing. Like I'll be doing a talk in Cleveland. On Civil War history, on a date to be in the Camp Cleveland, which was a famous Cleveland camp where soldiers prepared, coming up. So just look me up. Send me a question. Tell me your opinion. I love to talk and engage with readers. And thank you so much, John, for the invitation to come on and talk tonight.
Well, thank you. You've been very generous with your time. And if our watchers out there, you can see this repeatedly on Facebook, where I'll post it on my Civil War
Watch it over
Facebook
and over.
page. Yes, there you go. Laura, thanks again.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.